you, Moira, for the lovely introduction and for the kind invitation to come and speak with you this evening. It's great to see you here this evening. One of the sort of inherent dilemmas with talks about pestilence and plagues is sometimes it can scare people off. So let me begin by saying that I'm here this evening to present to you on behalf of our research team, which is the Canadian Program of Research on Ethics in a Pandemic, also known as CanPrep, which is based out of the Joint Centre for Bioethics here at the University of Toronto. And I'd also like to point out that it's been a great pleasure to work with Rory as part of this project. He's been a great asset to this team, and I fancy myself just a warm-up act for Rory here this evening. So we were just actually reflecting back about SARS, which is 7 years ago now. It seems closer than that, and I think that's perhaps because the memories of that fearful and anxiety-producing time still resonate quite clearly with us today. And it also does seem that in the time since then, there's sort of been a series of different threats and potential pandemics and viruses, from SARS to West Nile, and then we had a lot of talk about avian flu, and of course it turned out that swine flu was the actual threat most recently. So are we living in a new age of pandemics, as the headline on this issue of Newsweek declared? It's somewhat ironic, actually, because it wasn't so long ago that the Surgeon General in the US declared that the age of infectious diseases was over and that we had conquered infectious diseases. Of course, that proved not to be the case, and we seem to be, as I say, dealing with a series of different threats these days. So a working group was established here in the wake of SARS at the Joint Centre for Bioethics to study the ethical implications that arose out of SARS. And it did seem to be the case that many of the dilemmas that we were faced with during that unexpected episode of SARS were really issues about morals and values and ethical implications that we hadn't really thought about for some time. So, of course, in the wake of SARS, we did learn a great deal about the epidemiology and the pathophysiology of that particular virus. But more recently, it's swine flu that is posing the threat. And there's one theory that is circulating now that explains how that virus crossed over from animals to humans. And here's an explanation of that particular theory. Hello, please come in. So as I say, there was a working group struck at the Joint Centre for Bioethics looking at lessons learned from SARS. And I think this one particular quotation sort of captures well perhaps the most important lesson that came from SARS. And that is that in the midst of a crisis where guidance is incomplete, consequences uncertain, and information constantly changing, where hour by hour decisions involve life and death, fairness is more important rather than less. So that quote was written by student Jennifer Bell at the Joint Centre for Bioethics. And of course, these types of threats always capture the headlines, but what's been striking us more recently is that the press even has become more attuned to the fact that many of the issues that we're facing are in fact issues about values and morals and ethics. And increasingly they're turning to ethicists for their reports and for interviews for the media, and not just clinicians and laboratory scientists. So in the wake of SARS, the working group that I mentioned produced this report that some of you may be familiar with. It's called Stand on Guard for Thee. It's still available on the Joint Centre website, but I can give you that site later. And really what it did was proposed a framework for thinking about these issues in the context of an infectious disease outbreak. And this framework was specifically designed to guide the planning and preparedness work that institutions and organizations should undertake in advance of these kind of threats. And our framework was based around a list of values. As I say, values are really at the core of these issues. And we derived a list of 10 substantive values and 5 procedural values. And they're listed here. I won't read them out for you, but as I say, we can make available to you copies of our report for you. and it's been published widely as well, so you can probably find it just by Googling Stand on Guard for Thee. So arising out of SARS, it occurred to us that there were a number of key ethical challenges that presented themselves. And we didn't mean to suggest that this is an exhaustive list of challenges. There are certainly others in addition to this list, and I'm sure you have some of your own that you would like to add to this list. But we chose to focus really on these four because they seem to run across all of the various organizations and institutions that are members of the Joint Centre for Bioethics, which are largely all of the teaching hospitals, but also a few community hospitals in the Greater Toronto area. There are other issues I mentioned, specifically research ethics in the context of a pandemic, or issues related to the care and treatment of animals during infectious disease outbreaks. But these four really, as I say, sort of jump to the fore, and I'll be dealing with each of these in turn during the presentation. This name, Lawrence Dawson, may mean something to some of you. He's a lawyer and ethicist at Georgetown, and I think that he's captured here in this quote something that we were thinking about at this time, in the wake of SARS and in sort of with the specter of pandemic influenza before us. So Dr. Dawson wrote that somehow we have lost sight of the collective values of public health and the social contract. In the surge of interest in individual rights, we have forgotten the duty that each person owes one to another to ensure mutual health, safety, and security. So it was with that in mind that our working group at the Joint Centre for Bioethics started thinking about what is the next step in terms of the work that we've been doing in infectious disease. And as I said, we prepared that report, Stand on Guard for Thee, which was essentially derived and developed by a group of experts, medical doctors, ethicists, other clinicians and researchers, sitting around and thinking about the experience of SARS. The next step that occurred to us was to get that framework out there and allow people to think about it, allow them to adapt it, to try using it in their own organizations, and then to let us know what they thought about it. And it has been widely adapted throughout Canada. It formed the basis of the City of Toronto preparedness plan, the Ontario and the Canada plan, and it was adopted and adapted by many of the states south of the border and in other countries around the world. But as I say, the plan was basically founded on expert consensus. So the next step for us was to take this plan to the people, engage with the public, and see what their thoughts were. So we applied for funding from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and our project was called Engaging the Voices of the Public, and we specifically wanted to address that particular issue, to engage Canadians on these key ethical issues related to the planning that is involved with pandemics and infectious disease outbreaks. So I won't bore you with all the details of the methodology, but just quickly to give you the highlights. Our key questions were, what do Canadians identify as the primary goal of pandemic planning and preparedness? And what do they think about these four key ethical challenges that I listed earlier? So we undertook two different routes to get feedback from Canadians. We devised a national telephone survey of 500 Canadians. And we also conducted a series of town hall meetings where we would just meet with average Canadians in these different cities for a day and talk about these issues. I have the little asterisk beside the survey because that's largely what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, because the data from the town hall meetings, which are now complete, but the data is currently being analyzed and written up, so it's not quite yet available. But the survey data has been analyzed. We have our sample from all across Canada. You can see there that we used random digit dialing to achieve that sample of 500. Over 5,000 calls were made, but only 30. A lot of people have call display on there, so it's difficult to get people to pick up these days. But we were able to get our desired sample of 500.